Hello and welcome to the Trans-Pinay Summit 2021, sponsored by the Society of Trans Women of the Philippines. My name is Mikee Inton-Campbell, and I am Assistant Professor of Queer and Trans Studies at California State University, San Marcos. And my task today is to talk about the history of trans advocacy in the Philippines. Before I dive into our short little history, I like to make caveats and introductions every time I deliver this lecture, because it is a historicizing of the movement. There are some things that I kind of want to remind people about before we dive into the pre-colonial roots of trans advocacy and trans people in public spaces in the Philippines and globally, but also segue into contemporary trans advocacy in the Philippines and some of the issues that we need to tackle. Okay, so the first caveat that I want to make is that this is a very short, very abridged version of our history. It's not going to be a complete history. We don't have enough time to talk in the 20 minutes that I've been given to talk about the very long history of the global trans movement. So for the next couple of minutes, I will be speaking specifically about trans advocacy in the Philippines. And this history of trans advocacy is also the history of social movements in the Philippines. So while we are tracing the evolution of trans advocacy in the Philippines, we are also tracing the history of the social movements that have shaped these advocacy efforts in the country. Another thing that I kind of want to flag is that this history is not necessarily linear. In other words, it's not always going to be completely chronological. Yes, I've structured the talk so that it's chronological, it's easier to follow. But the history of social movements is the history of ideas and the history of issues. And sometimes these things have an ebb and a flow. They're not necessarily occurring on a, completely linear, completely straightforward line. So I do kind of want to say that the issues kind of become apparent and then they go away sometimes and then they come back. And it's always going to be like that when you look at the history of any kind of advocacy, and any kind of social movement. And another thing that I kind of want to emphasize is that history is not monolithic. So in these efforts to historicize trans social movements in the Philippines and the history of these advocacy efforts, there may be some things that we are not able to give space to. There are other histories that are coexisting within the timeline of what we're talking about. And I kind of want to say that whatever history I am talking about here, know that there are other histories going on at the same time, not just in the Philippines, but also globally and abroad, and in the Southeast Asian and Asian region in general. But I always like to begin my historicizing by looking at the pre-colonial roots of trans people in the Philippines and in the broader Asian region. I will not be talking very lengthily about the pre-colonial roots of transness. I believe Dr. Brenda Alegre and Dr. Jaya Jacobo will cover this in some of the other talks during this summit. So I'm not going to be talking at length about the pre-colonial roots. But what I did want to emphasize is that trans people have always had an important space in society. Pre-colonial and colonial era trans people have always had a place in the public sphere, visibly in the public. And in many cases, the roles that we performed are the social roles that we performed are quite important. You know, you're probably familiar with the babaylan, the bailan, the asog, the katalonan, these pre-colonial practices of shamanism and healing and spiritual mediation that can be read as trans because they're not completely cis heterosexual. Of course, there are issues when it comes to reading these identities as trans. But we can talk about that in the forum if you have any questions about that. But for now, the most important takeaway that I kind of want to emphasize is that trans people have always been in the public space. It's not like, at the turn of the 21st century, we started becoming prominent and we started becoming, more visible in the public sphere. No, we've always been there. So one of the first misconceptions that we kind of want to debunk is that transness, being transgender, is a contemporary phenomenon. It's not. We have always been there, and we have always kind of had a place within the social public life. So in looking at trans advocacy, the history of trans advocacy in the Philippines, we have to begin with STRAP, the Society of Trans Women of the Philippines. We were founded in 2002 by a group of 4 brilliant, very independent, very intelligent trans women, initially as a support group. So the original intention of the organization was to just provide a space for trans people to come together and talk about our lives in a safe that was safe, in a space that was welcoming and free from judgment, and in the spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood, of being siblings, of being comrades in the advocacy. So it wasn't initially intended to be, a strong activist advocacy organization. It was originally intended to be a safe space. The original name of STRAP, STRAP, is the Society of Transgender Rights Advocates of the Philippines. So we initially began as a very open organization. So we weren't only trans women. The founders were all trans women. But when they were coming out with a group, they were reaching out to trans men, they were reaching out to non-binary folk. But they found that trans women specifically had certain specific issues that they wanted to talk about, particularly transitioning and transition-related healthcare. So from the original Society of Transgender Rights Advocates of the Philippines, they rebranded to the Society of Transsexual Women of the Philippines. I believe this was done in 2007, 2008. And the wording of transsexual was incredibly important. It was deliberate. The organization wanted to focus specifically on trans women who wanted to medically and socially transition. Because at that time, medical transitioning was mostly, and today still is being done this way, mostly it was being done on the black market, without medical supervision. So hormones in the Philippines, are relatively easy to access if you can pay for them. They're expensive, but there generally are very few barriers to accessing them other than economics. You can go to the local Mercury drugstore and probably get some estrogen, some pills. Don't do that. But yeah, so one of the issues that the group wanted to focus on very early on in the forming of the group is safe medical trans affirming healthcare. So the wording of transsexual is, again, very, very deliberate. It's not like, they just pulled it out of the blue. No, it was very deliberate. But most recently, we have seen the need to kind of broaden the space and make it a bit more inclusive, so that we are also open to non-binary trans femmes, and people who may or may not be interested in medical transitioning. So recently we decided to rebrand the group as the Society of Trans Women of the Philippines. Sorry, there's a mistake in the slide. It's supposed to be trans women, 2 words separate. So now we go by the Society of Trans Women of the Philippines, and that is our official logo right there. We are also the first organization in the Philippines, trans organization in the Philippines. So again, 2002, very, very early on. And the context in which the organization came about was in the context of LGBT activism in the Philippines. We had the first Pride March in Asia in 1994, I believe. So we have a long history of queer LGBTQIA social movements in the Philippines, protest and rallies and parades and marches. So it kind of came about in that particular context. And these founders thought that there was a need to cater to an emerging trans population at that time. So this was in the late 90s. So finally, in 2002, STRAP was founded. But again, this is not to say that trans people have never been there. We've always been there. And then there have been earlier informal trans groups, but the first formal trans organization in the Philippines and the longest running trans organization in the Philippines is STRAP. Again, we initially were founded as a support group, but as the membership grew, as we expanded our base, we were also getting members who are professionals, members who were teachers, members who were working in the corporate world, members who were lawyers and doctors, and sex workers and parloristas and call center agents. So it was a big bunch of very diverse women. So we started expanding into doing education campaigns and public lectures, creating dialogues with local communities and the police, training them to think around trans issues, introducing the concept of transgender to them, introducing what trans people are and how to treat trans people with respect. And we also started participating in the global efforts to remember trans people who have been subjected to violence. So every year in November, we celebrate the Transgender Day of Remembrance. And STRAP began participating in these activities in the late 2000s. But I think our most significant achievement to date is the coining of the term trans-benign as an effort to localize the trans concept. So trans-benign was coined by STRAP in 2008, and it's kind of become a fairly popular, fairly well-received, fairly well-known term within the trans advocacy circles in the Philippines. So that was a term that was created by STRAP. And of course, the masculine equivalent would be trans-Pinoy. As an organization, we have had members who have delivered speeches at the UN, at the General Assembly. We have also participated in the writing of the Universal Periodic Review, that is a report on the situation of the human rights of trans people in the Philippines. This was in 2011. And in 2012, we started working with the World Health Organization on assessing the needs of trans populations, trans women especially, with regard to sexual health. In 2015, we also published a research that we conducted ourselves. We're very proud of this. This is the first trans-led research effort, or a situationer on the experiences of trans people in the Philippines. We got some funding from Transgender Europe, which is the largest trans organization in Europe. And from 2014 to 2019, me and some other members of the board and former officers sat on the board of ILGA World as representatives of the Trans Steering Committee. ILGA World is the largest network of LGBTQIA+ organizations around the world. And we're very proud to have been able to help that organization hone its constitution, create long-lasting impact within the region, within Asia, but also globally at the UN level. Most recently, in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, we saw the need to raise some funds for our sisters who have been displaced by the pandemic. So we teamed up with the AIDS Society of the Philippines, and we were able to raise 250,000 pesos that we were able to give out to 250 different trans women who were in need at the height of the pandemic. So STRAP started everything, but we are not the only trans organization in the Philippines, thankfully. There are several others that are very active and brilliant and equally good. And I like to think that STRAP gave birth to the trans advocacy movement, but that's just me being biased. Some other people might not see it that way. But so we have the Association of Transgender People in the Philippines, Colors from Cebu, Ganda Filipinas, founded by the brilliant Naomi Fontanos, Pioneer FDM, also very active, Transman Filipinas, and then Chase Goes, Transman Equality and Awareness Movement, also based in Cebu, the wonderful Lakambini Network, who many of our members also work with, and of course, Trans Deaf Philippines, catering to some trans people who have a disability. And the largest trans organization in the Philippines, with over 200 members, Trans Pinays of Antipolo organization. So I'm going to start wrapping up this little talk by talking about contemporary and intersecting issues. In other words, while STRAP and these other brilliant organizations have been working on trans rights in the Philippines for the longest time, since 2002 and earlier than that, there are still many issues that need to be addressed. There are those legislative issues. The anti-discrimination bill that has been in Congress for over 20 years now, still not passed into law. And more specifically for trans people, what we would like to see is the passage of a legal gender recognition law that will enable trans people to change our documents, our birth certificates, our driver's license, our passports, our school records, so that our legal documents are aligned with who we are. And we are not stuck with our assigned sex at birth, and we are not stuck with our dead names. Um, of course, we also want a legal gender recognition law that is accessible and based on um, self-determination rather than having requirements like um, forced sterilization or psychiatric diagnoses. So we want the most accessible, the most progressive kind of legal gender recognition law that we can pass. Um, other kinds of other issues are more social in nature. Of course, we are always working to end the violence and discrimination that many trans people suffer in the Philippines and around the world, of course. Unfortunately, trans women of color are still the among the most vulnerable populations around the world. Many trans women are still killed around the world, subjected to violence. And we remember, of course, our sister Jennifer Laude and others who have passed because of violence. Of sorry. Another key issue that we need to kind of address is the access to safe, affordable, trans-affirming healthcare. And it's not just transition-related medicine, it's not just hormones, it's also mental health care. So counseling and therapy for trans people. And in more general terms, we're still fighting for access to public spaces, access to equal opportunities in education and employment. And generally, and very broadly, issues of equity and equality in public life. Like I said earlier, trans people have always kind of served a prominent role in the public sphere in the history of the Philippines, and we are still here, and we are still fighting for equity and equality, and to be treated with respect. So I am going to end here, but thank you so much for listening to my little talk, and I look forward to answering some of your questions. Thank you so much.